Walking down the street, Twilight wasn't entirely sure which one she was on just yet. Normally she knew Ponyville like the back of her hoof, but in this twisted world she could be anywhere. She tried to remember the way the road had been arranged, the patterns the buildings were in. She tried to remember, but it felt like her home was so far away from her now. This world, filled with harsh brown and red metals that barely echoed, just wasn't her home. The empty streets carried the clinking of her hooves against metal as she continued on, looking for something recognizable. She turned the corner on a nearby street, hoping that this one would have more signs that she could follow. Pinky's map would have worked just fine if she'd been able to head straight from the farm to the house. But the world had to be difficult for her. Huh? Twilight murmured as a breeze of hot air passed over her coat, which caused Twilight to stop for a moment. There hasn't been a breeze in this world. Her head turned in the direction of the breeze it had come from, trying to find its source. The light of her pendant fell upon a large black mass of rotting and disconnected flesh that appeared to be slowly rising and falling. Her whole body froze, and her heart seemed to stop as her eyes traced the outline of the creature's body. Its jagged edges of its jaw and neck, the sharp teeth that glowed in the light, the large wings that extruded from its back. She felt her body begin to shake as she stared, not being able to see its pitch-black eyes, nor was it moving just yet. Perhaps the dragon hadn't seen her yet, or it appeared to be sleeping. She stared at it, feeling her heart pounding against her chest. She could swear the sound of it was echoing through the air around her. Her mind was telling her that she had to run, get to City Hall, but her body wasn't moving. She already knew just how terrifying this creature could be. She didn't need another reminder. Suddenly, the dragon shifted in its sleep. Twilight felt her eyes widen as the large head began to make its way up off the ground. Her eyes followed its head as it opened its mouth and let out a low rumbling growl as it seemed to yawn awake. It lowered its head, and she watched as its eyes opened, revealing the glossy black orbs beneath its eyelids. Its head tilted a little, and then the dragon was staring right at her. There was a moment of silence as the two of them seemed to stare at each other. Twilight couldn't so much as breathe, while the dragon seemed to be curious as to her presence. That's when she heard it. The low rumbling from the dragon's throat, the simple vibrations that meant only one thing. The dragon opened its mouth, and she could already see the flames licking at the back of its throat, rushing forward to burn her. Her body finally unfroze, adrenaline coursing through her veins now. She'd come too far to just let herself die now. Her legs kicked in, and she leapt, just barely avoiding the blazing flames that spewed out where she had just been standing. She could feel the roaring heat singeing her hair on her tail and heating the back of her legs. She winced in pain, knowing full well that if she stopped, she was dead. The loud, ground-shaking roar erupted through the silent town, nearly knocking her off balance. She stared ahead, running as fast as her legs could carry her, as she heard the loud flapping of wings. The dragon was taking off, and there was no doubt in her mind that it was going to be chasing her. "Where's the City Hall? Where is it?" Twilight cried out, her breathing growing ragged as she continued to run. She turned down another street, hoping to confuse the dragon about her whereabouts, but the sounds of heavy breathing and beating wings continued to be right behind her. Her head desperately looked left and right, looking for some kind of sign that she was going the right way. The rushing of buildings going by her didn't help. She didn't have any time to stop and observe. Another ground-shaking roar bellowed out right behind her as she felt her skin crawl with thoughts of being burned alive. She made another sharp turn down another street. The wings unleashed a large gust as they passed just behind her. She knew she wasn't going to get away for long. "Where is it? Where is it?" She berated herself for having gotten so lost. This was her home. She should have known better than this. A stream of fire suddenly rained down from the sky in front of her, forcing her to skid to a halt. The inferno, just a few feet from her, was melting the metal on the floor, causing it to drip and ooze down into an infinite abyss below. Twilight instantly turned on her hooves and ran down a street next to her, panting and heaving as her legs worked as hard as they could to get her away. The powerful beating wings seemed to be coming from every direction now, that roar reverberating throughout the town with every passing moment. Another stream of fire appeared before her, and her hooves instantly made another turn. She didn't know where she was going, her head frantically searching for some kind of clue. Was she going to just be lost forever? There was no way she could keep going and run away from the dragon forever. It was too fast. It was able to keep up with her, and its senses meant that it should be able to find her easily. Was this really as far as she would go? From the corner of her eye, something appeared. She turned her head to try and look at it, but it was gone as soon as she'd noticed it. Whatever it was, it had turned down the next road ahead of her. It wasn't the dragon, that's all she knew. She mashed her hooves against the metal floor and turned down the road she had just seen it run before and following down the street. At the end of the street, she saw movement again, making yet another turn. Was it leading her? What could still be there to lead her? She already knew that the monsters were just as afraid of the dragon as she was. It killed everything in its path. If whatever was running away, too, knew how to get to safety, all she could do was follow it. Another bellowing roar told her that she didn't have time to think about it any more on the matter. The stream of fire spewed forth and melted the road in front of her, forcing her to turn in the path that the creature had as well. The large flap of wings told her that the dragon was still close, wind whipping her mane everywhere. She ran down the street, a particularly long one, her chest beginning to burn, her limbs straining from the stress of the sudden exercise. Her eyes caught a glimpse of the object again, though this time a little clearer. She could have sworn she saw the blur of pink turn the corner. Twilight nearly jumped out of her skin as the dragon landed hard on the metal before her, roaring loudly as it stood directly in her path. It swiveled its mouth down, fully intending to devour its meal instantly. Her hooves jumped, and the mouth came inches away from making her the dragon's next meal. Her body trembled, rolling from the sudden jump to escape the dragon. She quickly got to her hooves and ran down the road the pink blur had traveled. The dragon's roar shook the earth once more, before the heavy wings set it off into the sky once again. The fast, rhythmic thumping of her heart played in her ears as each breath threatened to drown her. Her lungs were bursting, demanding to have the chance to calm down. But the moment she stopped, she would be dead. Her eyes caught a glimpse of the pink blur once more, discerning that it was a tail. It had to be the tail of a pony. Was that pony leading her through this? Leading her away from the dragon? If so, she couldn't have been more grateful. She turned the corner once more, and almost came to a stop. That's impossible. Twilight gawked. Right in front of her, imposing down on her, with the large walls that she was so familiar with, was Canterlot Castle. "This can't be here!" she almost shouted. However, the words were drowned out with the loud roar of the dragon that was still right behind her. Without taking another moment to think about it, she ran straight to the front doors of the castle. She slammed her body into the doors, hoping that they would just burst open for her, only to find herself bouncing backwards into the town. She stared at the doors before rushing up and pulling on the handle, trying to force them open. The loud thud of the dragon landing came from right behind her, the doors refusing to budge open. The dragon roared loudly, shaking the ground beneath her hooves and causing her to slip and land on her stomach. She shook her head and stared at the door, suddenly noticing that there was a keyhole there for her. Without thinking, she pulled out the key that Pinky had given her from the note and jammed it into the lock. With a twist, the door gave a loud click, and the key disappeared into ash. She jumped to her hooves and swung the door open, just as heat began to prick at the back of her neck. She jumped inside and turned, summoning her magic to grip the doors. Just as the dragon's blazing fire began to spew, she slammed the door shut on him. She heard the mighty impact of the flames hitting the door, the light from the blaze creeping through the cracks around it. She took several steps backwards, watching as the fires blazed right behind the door for several moments, before finally dying down. She held her breath for several moments, as she heard the thudding of his footsteps through them, the loud huff of the dragon, smelling the door for any sign of her. Twilight swallowed hard, just standing as still as she possibly could. Then, almost as though it was a miracle, she heard the sound of the dragon's large wings beating as it took off into the sky once again. She stood frozen to her spot for several minutes, waiting till the wing beat was long gone. When she was sure, she let out a heavy sigh that she had been holding inside of her body out, and felt herself collapse. Her heavy panting and beating heart was all she could hear now. She was just thankful to be alive. She lay there for a minute or two, just letting her breath catch up to her. The throbbing of her heart moved from her head to her hooves, aching pains telling her she'd run too hard for too long. She groaned as she tried to sit up, not knowing what to expect. After all, Canterlot Castle had just magically shown up in the middle of Ponyville. On top of that, the keeping had given her had opened its doors and saved her from being burned alive. "Wait, Pinky!" Twilight said, suddenly remembering the blurred pink tail that she had followed here. She twisted her head around, looking for any sign of the pink mare, but all she could see around her was the blood-stained steel walls that surrounded her. Decaying portraits hung askew on the walls, where the windows were now steel bars held together by chain-link fence. Twilight blinked in confusion, rubbing her head. "I feel like I've been here before," she murmured quietly to herself, looking down at the floor. There were the normal gray tiles of Canterlot, only gray and rusted, with grime forming along the cracks. "Did Pinky make it inside?" she asked, turning around to look at the door she had just come through. However, the door was now gone, and in its place was a large steel wall, the same that made up the sides of the castle. The missing doors told her one thing. There was no turning back now. Just as that thought crossed her mind, a sound began to echo through the castle. Her ears perked up as she tried to listen closely to it. It was a strange harmonic sound, just winding its way through the castle. It was music. The melody was quiet, but she could almost hear it well enough. It was almost as though the melody danced through the air, dulled beats dragging from chord to chord. The instrument sounded like it hadn't been played in years, and was picked up just to be played at that very moment. It sent chills down her spine, though she wasn't certain why. If there's music, there must be a source. If there's a source, maybe I'll find a pony. She thought for a moment, before her ears flattened against her skulls. Or I could find another monster, which is more likely. She swallowed hard. But I have to move forward. Pinky said if I got here, I could save every pony. Just how do I do that? Twilight shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts and focus on what was important. The haunting melody was slowly crawling through the castle, and she had nowhere else to go but forward. She was thankful that she was in Canterlot Castle, though, rather than the malformed streets of Ponyville. Even if Canterlot was twisted, transformed, and designed like a cage, it was still Canterlot. She knew this castle like the back of her hoof. All she had to do was figure out where she needed to go. Stepping in the hallways, she knew exactly where the entrance led. The main hall opened before her eyes, transformed and shaped the same way the rest of the castle had been changed. Its open space that would normally be filled with ponies going about their various appointments or jobs, as barons as everything else. Though the entire castle was built like a cage now, it didn't seem to contain a single soul inside of it, aside from her. Her eyes wandered up the stairs, where Princess Celestia would normally stand upon greeting guests or royal visitors, to gaze at the mural that adorned the wall. The normal depictions of Celestia raising the sun and bringing grace to the land had been replaced. In its stead was a picture of Celestia, large and towering, in the center of the picture. Only one of her eyes were visible from the picture, colored a deep red as it stared down at the carnage taking place. Below her, houses and ponies were being engulfed in flames, some burning alive, some running away and losing everything they'd ever held dear. Above her, the moon was eclipsing the sun, creating a dark halo above her mentor's head. To the left of her mentor was a black circle, depicting a triangle within a strange twisted lines and runic lettering around the circle. And to the other side of her mentor was a symbol she'd seen a few times now throughout the town, a symbol she'd seen Magus draw to create safe havens in the town, a red circle that had 3 smaller circles within it, surrounded by runic writing. I've seen that one before, but what does it mean? Twilight wondered curiously to herself. She stepped closer to the mural, trying to get a better look at it. As she reached the center of the room, she heard the sound of metal hitting metal as her medallion began to buzz. She froze in her spot and heard the metal clashing together again. This time the sound came from directly above her. Her head snapped to look up at what she saw was a giant chandelier moving along the ceiling. A loud snap echoed through the main room, and the large decoration came rushing down to greet her. Twilight jumped out of the way, covering her head, expecting the device to come crashing down. However, the sound of something heavy being yanked with chains announced that something had stopped it from hitting the ground mid-air. A shrill screaming whine came from behind her. She turned her head to look at what just happened. When she thought was a chandelier was actually a giant set of royal ornaments that seemed to have been welded onto a fleshy creature. A giant circular crown consisted of its back, with the fleshy back of the creature arcing into an empty space the crown left. A tiara hung from one side, while the pendant hung from another. The creature appeared to have regal armor welded to random parts of his body, while the rest of the skin was decaying. Its front arms hung loosely by its side, as if wanting to grab hold and latch onto something. Its back legs were broken and malformed, curled painfully into the crown. Its head looked like a pony, but with the eyes missing, and its mouth was full of what had once been flat teeth that were now jagged and broken. The grotesque creature swung its head, letting out a whining screech of pain, trying to twist and contort to find something to grab hold of. Twilight's ears flickered at the sound. It really didn't sound like the creature was only in pain. It sounded like the creature was crying. The creature snapped its mouth closed, and then let out another pained cry. It knew someone had been there, but it couldn't see them. It couldn't sense them. It was almost as if the creature was alone, looking for a companion, but didn't know how to treat them right. It hurt anything it got into its grip. Twilight just stared at the creature for what felt like minutes, before rattling of its chains pulled the creature back up towards the ceiling. It calmed down, ceasing its wailing, and curled up into the regalia that covered its body. When it reached the ceiling, it clicked back into position and remained silent once more. Her medallion ceased its buzzing. The swallowing of her nerves down once more, and she got back on her hooves, staring up at the stairs to the mural. She stared at the depiction of Celestia for a moment, then at the ponies burning to death in their homes. She didn't seem like anything Celestia would ever have done in her castle, nor did it ever seem like something that praised her. No, it reflected something more like she'd seen for one of the many villains that destroyed Equestria's lands, hurt its citizens, and wanted to the downfall of the kingdom. But instead of any of them, it was depicting Celestia. But Celestia would never hurt her citizens, would she? Twilight wondered aloud. She'd seen many times as a foal Celestia doing everything in her power to help her people, to do what was best for every pony, even sacrificing her free time and duty just to help some pony less fortunate. The depiction here didn't seem like something she'd ever seen Celestia do. It must be this world, Twilight surmised. It's playing tricks on my mind, showing me things that aren't real again. She took a deep breath and looked to the stairs that branched off to her right and left. She knew that the throne room was to the right. Something in her gut told her that was the right way to go, that if there was a chance of saving every pony in this town, that was the right direction. With a deep breath of resolve, she stepped up to the metal stairs that would lead to the throne room. At the top of the stairs, she was greeted with a new, long hallway that seemed to stretch out further than she could see. The hallway looked the same as the one she was familiar with, only metallic and rusted over with blood and grime. But she couldn't be sure if it led to where she wanted to go. Only one way to find out, she murmured softly to herself, and began walking. Her hooves echoed loudly around her as she walked. The steel bar windows only showed the pitch-black darkness that lurked outside. The further she walked, though, the more the windows began to change. Soon they changed from the steel bars and chain-link fences to stained-glass depictions of ponies. There were several different ones, and she stopped just long enough to view what was being depicted. One depicted a pony being burned to death on a stake. Another showed two ponies clashing, each with a different weapon instead of armor. Another portrayed a pony being hung from a cord held by the moon. Another depicted a mother throwing her child to hungry alligators below. Another showed a pony standing over the corpse of another, a bloody knife in its mouth. Another presented a dead angel being carried in the arms of a crestfallen pony. "I swear, I've seen these before," Twilight murmured, furrowing her brow at the images. "But where?" Her mind thought it over as her hooves carried her forward, her thoughts mulling over until the hallway suddenly came to an end. Her hooves stopped as she stared at the large open room that she had just found herself wandering into. It was Canterlot's large ballroom. "The ballroom's here? But it shouldn't be—" she murmured quickly. She walked deeper into the malformed ballroom. The stage where bands once gathered was now just a giant cage, metal bars forming a circle around where the band would play. Along the edges of the room, there were a few long-since discarded tables that showed their age. The windows around the room were filled with stained glass depictions of ponies being burned alive, suffering at the hands of their almighty ruler. "Is there supposed to be something here?" And just as those words left her mouth, she heard the rattling of metal echoing throughout the room from behind her. She swung her head around to stare at the hallway she had just exited from, as a metal door slammed shut across the hallway entrance. She was now trapped inside of the ballroom.